I'm Dr. Jody Barnes. I'm a Heritage Trust archaeologist with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, and I am working at the Tom Yawkey Wildlife Center Heritage Preserve, a property owned by the Department of Natural Resources. It's a Gullah fishing village. In 2017, during Hurricane Irma, storm surge caused severe beach erosion, and human remains were eroded from the shore of South Island on the Tom Yawkey Wildlife Center. A fisherman noticed the remains and contacted DNR, and the DNR contacted the Richland County coroner. Dr. Bill Stevens is a historical archaeologist and the assistant coroner in Richland County, and they came and excavated the human remains and found a series of buttons and ceramics and other artifacts. The human remains were found face down in the beach. And so Dr. Stevens did a study of those human remains and found that he was a young 18 to 20-year-old African American male. There was no sign of there was no cause of death that he could identify, but based on the way the remains were found on the beach, it looked like he washed up on the shore as a result of drowning. He was found where it appears on the 1907 map of Cat North and South Island as a fisherman's village. And so this started a whole study of an archaeological study of this site so that we can identify the human remains, hope to find descendants, find out maybe if we can find some people who are related to him and give him a proper burial, but also learn more about this important site that is that we don't talk about, the history of fishing and this African American fishing village at the turn of the 20th century. We sent the clothing and materials found with him to Clemson University, and they were able to identify the material as natural rubber, silk, Prosser 4-hole buttons, which date to the 1880s, 1890s, as well as a gilt and Prosser button and a couple of gilt buttons that they were unable to date. And they thought that the materials and the buttons look like fishermen at the turn of the 20th century, like in these photos that you see here. One of the things we're looking at is the history of hurricanes in the area. We're thinking about the ways that living on the sea islands and being a fisherman, what kinds of how that might have been a stress for their lives. And with the human remains, we're thinking about how frequent was it for people to drown. Michael Thompson did a study in Charleston, and he found that drowning was one of the most common cause of death during the late 19th century. So we started doing archaeology to learn more about the fishing village and the people who lived and worked there. We used the 1928 plat of the fishing village and overlaid it on an aerial photograph that you can see here. And so we dug what we would call shovel test pits, small excavation units, every 15 meters in the village to try to target households. You can see that the village is eroding from the shore. There are bricks and glass bottles and ceramics all over the shore. DNR applied for 2 grants to address the effects of climate change on archaeological sites. And this is one of the sites that we're concerned about, as being a Gullah Geechee fishing village. And we can see from looking at aerial photographs and maps how quickly the site is eroding. In 1949, the aerial photographs show this as being a roadbed, and then another addition on the other side of the road there would have been houses, and on the shore we see an early this is one of the best signs of erosion. When you have a U.S. Corps of Engineers geological marker eroding from the shore, that's a pretty good sign that erosion is happening. Most of the artifacts we're finding really reflect the day-to-day, everyday lives. Like we have dishes and ceramics, but we do have these lead fishing weights, the cast net weights that we found. We see lots of glass and ceramics, the everyday things that people use for eating, medicine, eroding from the shore, that tell us that there's, this site is quickly being lost. Native American ceramics that we've found here, showing that people have been here since about 4,000 years ago. The bricks here, so you can see the evidence of the house. So this one has the a maker's mark on it that gives us some clues to when the house would have been built or renovated. So I think about Gullah Geechee as being about origins in West Africa, and so the ways that we see West African traditions coming to the Carolina coast, and the emergence of a particular culture, a culture specific to the Low Country and to the Carolina coast, because of the interrelations between enslaved Africans, indigenous people, and European settlers. And so the cultures that emerge on the plantation sites during plantation slavery is where the roots of Gullah Geechee culture. And then it becomes a little bit more complicated because we think about the ways that planters work to suppress African cultures during slavery. We can think about the Vesey Uprising. You start to see the really the limits, the change of African traditions to a more plantation economy, restructuring the slave settlements so there are single rows rather than set up like an African village. So really it's kind of, and so then an emergence, a re-emergence of Gullah Geechee culture with emancipation. See a resurgence of religious and spiritual traditions, resurgence in foodways, and it's also about a resistance to the ways that people have been living during plantation slavery as people reclaimed their cultural identities. I want to set the scene for fishing. So on this property, South Island, Cat Island, there were at least 7 plantations, and so archaeologically, we've only excavated one plantation here at Yawkey, but archaeologically we know that fishing was a way to substitute, to add to people's diets, to the rations that they were given, right? During excavations of plantations, that's what we see is a lot of fish bones and wild animal bones that where people are hunting and fishing to supplement their diet, right? Because on a plantation, they are given limited cuts of meat and molasses and small and rations that are not necessarily or meager. And so we see fishing as a way of being a important way of life. And they're skilled hunters and fishermen, right? These are people who are also doing it for the planters, that they are the hunting guides. If you read the slave narratives, the ex-slave narratives, that there's people who talk about how that after emancipation that they are hunting, that they're such skilled dog users and such skilled fishermen that they are a little bit of a threat to the white elite that continue to maintain the land. So as after emancipation, people, decide that they would much rather hunt and fish for a living and make a living that way than work on rice plantations. And that's, there's already a shortage of labor on those rice plantations, right? There's a challenge to finding people to continue to work the plantations. And part of that is that people can make a living and hunt and fish and survive that way without having to do all the heavy labor of rice fields. As the plantations, as rice dies and it moves out westward to Arkansas, you see all these northern folks move down to the Carolinas and buy these plantations, and you see a resurgence of hunting and fishing camps. And these places need African American faces and bodies and labor to continue that tradition, right? The idea of the hunt camp becomes needs the ideas of the plantation in order to continue. You see these two things, a resurgence of the plantations and the rebuilding them in this Victorian model that differs from the ways that they looked during the antebellum period. Hunting and fishing, right? And the need for African American labor, and at the same time a desire to be an independent worker and not and necessarily work for people. And so these dual things happening at the turn of the 20th century. This site where we are, there's the whole gaps of we know that around 1811 that they start to cut this up into narrow 100-foot lots. Who owns it? I don't know at that stage. We're just looking at deed research. This is what we have to come back to. But by the turn of the 20th century, 1880s, 1890s, you start to see some black landowners on this part of this land. So who all? We've got all the deeds that Tom Yonke cleared titles, so we have all the deeds, and we're working on transcribing them so we can kind of figure out all those land transactions. So we see on this land in the we have a plat from the 1928 where we have J.E. McQuaid, who was a northerner from he was a New Yorker, and he moved to South Carolina. The turn of the 20th century, on the 1900 census, he is listed as a fish dealer. Some point he acquires land here on the in this village, and he later opens a cannery, and so he's part of this growing seafood industry, right? I mean, like at that turn of the 20th century, you start to see, thinking material culture, canning of seafood. Excavated a plantation in Arkansas, and you would be surprised at all the early late 19th century seafood cans that people were, because so there was that increased industry which Georgetown and this was happening at this time. So there were a number of African American landowners. Robert Ellison was a schooner captain in 1900. E.F. Ford was a fisherman in 1900 and later became a fishing dealer, 1910. Thomas Alston was a cook during the Civil War and later is a tugboat captain. Jonas Brown was listed in the census as a fisherman and his wife is a midwife. So these are the African American people who lived and worked on in this fishing village. And the census data really helps us, imagine people who would have occupied the village. I mean, archaeologically, we see lots of, we find the glass bottles, the pottery, and so to be able to put a name and a face and kind of envision people's lives here, that's where combining the primary sources and the archaeological evidence together.